Picture this. It's December 1980, just after Christmas. You're a trained United States Air Force security officer stationed at a NATO base in rural England. It's 3 in the morning, and you're about to investigate what you think is a downed aircraft in the forest beyond the perimeter fence. But when you push through those pine trees, you don't find wreckage or flames. Instead, you encounter something that will haunt you for the rest of your life. A silent, glowing object that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been trained to understand. This isn't science fiction. This isn't a campfire story. This is the Rendlesham Forest Incident, often called Britain's Roswell, and it remains one of the most credible and well-documented UFO cases in military history. Unlike most UFO encounters that rely on fading memories and questionable evidence, this case has something extraordinary: real-time audio recordings, official military memos, physical trace evidence, and testimony from multiple trained observers who stood their ground and documented what they saw. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to explore what really happened during those strange December nights in the Suffolk countryside. We'll examine the evidence that skeptics can't explain away, dive into the mysterious binary code that one witness claims he received telepathically, and ask the uncomfortable questions that still linger more than 40 years later. By the end, you'll understand why this case refuses to fade into history and why it might represent something far more significant than just strange lights in the woods. To understand the Rendlesham Forest Incident, you first need to understand the setting. This wasn't some remote location where credibility could easily be questioned. RAF Woodbridge and its twin installation RAF Bentwaters were active United States Air Force bases on British soil during the height of the Cold War. These weren't ceremonial posts or quiet administrative centers. They were operational military installations housing American personnel, sophisticated equipment, and, according to many sources, nuclear weapons. The surrounding landscape consisted of dense pine forest, row after row of trees stretching in every direction along the military perimeter. During daylight hours, the forest felt open and navigable, but at night it transformed into a wall of darkness, the kind of place where your flashlight beam only reaches so far and shadows play tricks on even the most disciplined mind. The timing matters too. Christmas 1980 should have been quiet. Most personnel were off duty, celebrating the holiday season. The bases operated with skeleton crews, just enough people to maintain essential watch. It was supposed to be peaceful. Instead, it became the setting for one of the strangest military encounters on record. The strangeness began in the early morning hours of December 26th. Around 3 in the morning, security personnel spotted bright lights descending into the woods just beyond the eastern fence line. The lights didn't behave like anything familiar. They didn't streak across the sky like meteors or flash like lightning. Instead, they moved slowly, deliberately, as if being guided down with intention. The initial response followed standard protocol. When you're stationed at a military base and something appears to crash near your perimeter, you investigate. A patrol was quickly assembled. Staff Sergeant Jim Penston, Airman First Class John Burrows, and Airman Ed Cabansag were among the first responders. They took a vehicle as far as the perimeter road would allow, then continued on foot into the forest. What they expected to find was wreckage, twisted metal, smoke, perhaps fire. What they actually encountered was something entirely different. The forest felt wrong from the moment they entered it. The air seemed charged with static electricity, creating the sensation you feel just before a lightning strike. The usual sounds of the night had gone silent. Birds weren't calling, but in the distance, farm animals were reacting violently. Dogs barked frantically. Horses moved in agitated circles in their paddocks. Then, through the trees, they saw it. Flashing lights, red, blue, and white, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern. But these weren't lights high in the sky. They were low, maybe a meter or two above the ground, and they appeared to be attached to something solid. Cabansag remained near the vehicle to maintain radio contact, while Peniston and Burroughs pressed deeper into the forest. As they moved closer, they began to make out a shape between the trees. According to Peniston's later testimony, what they saw was a structured craft, roughly triangular in shape, approximately 3 meters wide at the base and 2 meters high. The surface appeared metallic, but unlike any metal they recognized. It looked smooth, almost like black glass, with no visible seams or rivets. The most unsettling detail? The object was completely silent. No engine noise, no mechanical hum, no sound of any kind. Just light and absolute stillness. What happened next separates Rendlesham from countless other UFO sightings. Peniston didn't just observe from a distance. According to his account, he approached the object directly. He claims he touched it, felt its surface, and examined strange symbols etched along its side, markings that didn't resemble any known language or military identification system. The craft remained motionless during his approach, but before he could conduct a more thorough examination, it began to move. Not with the roar of engines or the wash of rotor blades, but silently, weaving between the trees without disturbing a single branch. The movement was too fluid, too precise to be any known aircraft. And then, just as mysteriously as it had appeared, it vanished deeper into the forest. Disoriented and without clear guidance on how to proceed, the patrol returned to their vehicle and reported what they had witnessed. Their account was logged as unexplained lights in the forest. No immediate alarm was raised. No jets were scrambled. The event was treated cautiously as something unusual but not necessarily threatening. But within hours, word began spreading among the personnel. Quietly, behind closed doors, men who had been there that night started sharing what they'd seen. The official assumption of an aircraft crash had already been ruled out. There was no missing plane, no debris field, no distress calls from nearby airports. Whatever those lights were, they didn't belong to any known aircraft, and they hadn't simply crashed. They had moved with apparent intelligence and purpose. When dawn broke on December 26th, the forest looked different. The oppressive darkness lifted, revealing the orderly rows of pine trees and frozen ground. But those who had been there during the night knew something significant had occurred, and they needed to document it properly. Peniston returned to the site with several other personnel, this time in full daylight and with authorization to conduct a formal investigation. What they found added a disturbing physical dimension to the previous night's encounter. In a small clearing, roughly 100 meters inside the tree line, they discovered 3 distinct indentations in the soil, forming a perfect triangle. Each mark was evenly spaced, approximately 12 feet apart. The depressions weren't deep, but they were clear, as if something of considerable weight had rested briefly on the ground. Near one of the impressions, they found broken branches, snapped cleanly rather than weathered or rotted. Several trees nearby showed signs of scorching along their bark at mid-level height. There was no smell of burning, no ash, but the discoloration was unmistakable. Then came the readings that would become one of the most contentious aspects of the case. Someone from the investigation team had brought a handheld Geiger counter, standard radiation detection equipment. As they swept the clearing, the meter began to tick. The radiation levels weren't dangerously high, nothing that would trigger an evacuation, but they were significantly elevated compared to the surrounding soil, particularly in the indentations and on one of the scorched tree trunks. Peniston documented everything meticulously. He sketched the indentations, measured the distances, photographed the scorched trees, and noted peculiar marks in the frozen ground that didn't match animal tracks or human boots. Later, he would describe them as not random, as if they followed some kind of pattern. The team spent over an hour at the site. Soil samples were collected. Every angle was photographed, but no explanation was offered by superiors and no conclusions were drawn. The only certainty was that something unusual had made physical contact with the ground. December 27th brought an uneasy quiet. Officially, the incident had been recorded, but not escalated. The base resumed its normal rhythm, at least on paper, but those who had witnessed the events knew something wasn't finished. As darkness fell again, a subtle tension returned. This second night is less documented than the others, but multiple personnel reported seeing more unusual lights over the trees. A civilian call was placed to Suffolk police describing strange lights and a pulsing object low in the sky. The timing matched exactly with observations from base personnel watching the eastern perimeter. Police arrived, investigated, and found nothing conclusive to report. Inside the base, airmen on overnight duty began speaking in low tones about movement in the tree line. At one guard post, someone claimed to see a flicker of red light in the same direction where the original object had disappeared. Without official orders to reinvestigate, no team was dispatched, but the whispers grew louder. One unnamed equipment technician later recalled stepping outside during the midnight shift and noticing an odd glow coming from behind the trees. It wasn't dramatic like floodlights, just a subtle, pale white light that seemed to generate from within the forest itself. He thought it might be headlights at first, but the light didn't move. It simply hovered, then faded out. The following morning brought another strange detail. The same clearing visited by Peniston's team now showed fresh impressions in the soil, different from what had been documented the day before. A junior airman from maintenance had apparently wandered into the woods during the early morning hours and returned covered in frost, pale and refusing to discuss what he'd been doing out there. These unconfirmed accounts from the second night never made it into official files. No formal incident was recorded, but the atmosphere on base was changing. Witnesses from the first night stopped discussing the event openly. Some joked that they'd been mistaken. Others pulled back entirely, as if an invisible pressure to stay quiet had descended over the entire installation. By the third night, the situation had reached a tipping point. Too many people had seen too much. Strange marks had been found. Equipment had registered anomalies. And around the base, silence was beginning to feel less like discipline and more like suppression. That's when Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, the deputy base commander of RAF Bentwaters, made a decision that would define the entire case. On the night of December 28th, he assembled a team and personally entered Rendlesham Forest to investigate. This wasn't a junior security patrol. This was a senior officer taking direct command. More importantly, Halt brought a handheld audio recorder. He wanted documentation, not just reports typed up from memory days later, but a real-time record of what they saw, felt, and experienced in the moment. That recording, now known as the Halt Tape, would become the most significant piece of evidence in the entire case. The team entered the forest around 9 in the evening. The temperature was near freezing, and the ground was hard underfoot. Halt began recording almost immediately, narrating as they walked with a calm, methodical tone. You can hear him describe approaching the area where the object had been sighted, noting the frozen ground and the 3 equidistant marks forming a triangle. As they swept the clearing with the Geiger counter, the device began clicking with increasing regularity. Halt states on the tape that readings are significantly higher than normal background radiation, especially near the indentations. But then, everything changed. While scanning the area, one of the men spotted a pulsing red light through the trees. At first, it appeared stationary, just a soft glow hovering above the horizon line. They assumed it might be a distant beacon or star, but then it began to move. On the tape, you can hear Halt's voice shift slightly as he describes what's happening. The light is blinking, moving toward them, throwing off sparks that shift from red to blue. The object appears to dart between trees, moving intelligently, stopping and starting without any sound. At one point, Halt instructs his team to turn off their flashlights to better observe how the light moves. Then something even stranger occurs. The single red light seems to divide into multiple points, 3 or 4 smaller lights that drift in different directions before reassembling into one. There's no downward motion suggesting flares. There's no sound of engines, just silence and deliberate movement. More than once, the team reports narrow beams of light coming down from the object to the ground, pencil-thin shafts that appear to scan the area below. At one point, Halt reports that a beam seems to be directed toward the base's weapons storage area, the location where nuclear ordnance was allegedly kept. The team remained in the forest for nearly 3 hours, tracking the lights from multiple positions. The objects never came within direct range, always staying just beyond reach, slipping between trees or fading out entirely. But everyone there agreed, these lights weren't random. They moved with purpose, as if aware of the observers. When Halt and his team finally returned to base, he didn't immediately sound an alarm or call for backup. Instead, he compiled his observations and, on January 13, 1981, wrote a brief memo to the British Ministry of Defense. The memo was titled Unexplained Lights and summarized the sequence of events across the 3 nights in carefully neutral language. What's striking about the Halt memo is what it doesn't say. There's no mention of a craft touching down, no dramatic descriptions of beams targeting the weapons area, no technical speculation. Instead, Halt referred to unusual lights, indentations, and a possible landing. The language reads more like a weather report than a description of one of the most significant military encounters with the unknown. Some believe Halt wrote it that way deliberately, downplaying the tone to allow the memo to pass through official channels without triggering unwanted attention. Others think he was instructed to avoid speculation and stick only to facts that couldn't be disputed. Either way, the memo was received, filed, and quietly shelved. It wasn't until several years later that the memo surfaced publicly through a Freedom of Information Act request in the United States. Its plain, understated language only made it more compelling. Why would a high-ranking military officer submit an official report to the British government about unexplained lights and landing traces if there wasn't something substantial behind the story? The Halt tape itself has been analyzed extensively over the decades. Audio forensics experts have examined it, military historians have reviewed it. No tampering has ever been detected. The voices match known personnel. The sound profile matches open woodland in winter. The equipment being used, including the Geiger counter, is standard issue for that era. What makes the tape so powerful isn't what's said, but how it's said. There's no sensationalism, no attempts to theorize or embellish. It's simply a military officer narrating his observations for the record. You can hear the discipline in his voice, the careful choice of words, the methodical description of events as they unfold. Halt didn't go into the woods looking for a story. He went to document something unusual and came back with more questions than answers. If the case had ended with the Halt tape and memo, it would still rank as one of the most credible UFO encounters on record. But years later, another layer emerged, one that would divide researchers and witnesses alike. Jim Penniston, who had been one of the first to approach the craft on the initial night, revealed something he claimed to have kept private for decades. He said that when he touched the object in the forest, he experienced what he described as a mental download. It wasn't words or images, but sequences of binary code, long strings of ones and zeros that flooded his mind with overwhelming clarity. Penniston claimed he didn't understand what was happening at the time. The compulsion to record the numbers was so strong that the next day he filled pages of his military notebook with binary digits. No explanation, no label, just columns of ones and zeros that meant nothing to him. He didn't mention the binary code in his original debrief. He didn't discuss it with fellow witnesses. It wasn't until the early 2000s, during a television interview, that he revealed the notebook publicly. Understandably, many questioned why he'd waited so long. His explanation was simple. He didn't think anyone would believe him. The sighting alone was difficult enough to explain. Introducing the idea of telepathically received binary code from a hovering object would only damage his credibility further. Eventually, researchers attempted to decode the sequences using ASCII, a standard computer text format. What emerged were several English phrases and a list of geographic coordinates. The phrases were cryptic: exploration of humanity, continuous for planetary advance, and the particularly strange, eyes of your eyes. But the coordinates were even more intriguing. When plotted on a map, they pointed to ancient and mysterious locations around the globe. The pyramids of Giza in Egypt, the Nazca Lines in Peru, the Temple of Apollo in Greece, and most mysteriously, an obscure mythical location called High Brazil, often described in Irish folklore as a vanishing island that appears once every 7 years off the western coast of Ireland. Skeptics immediately questioned the authenticity of the code. Could it have been fabricated or added to the notebook years later? Could it have been reverse engineered to match known landmarks? Peniston denied all of that, insisting the notebook was authentic and unaltered, simply a recording of something he experienced but didn't fully understand. The United States Air Force never commented on the code, neither did the British Ministry of Defense. No formal analysis was ever released. To this day, those pages remain one of the most debated elements of the Rendlesham case. Some dismiss them entirely as an afterthought. Others see them as the key message behind the entire event.
What makes the Rendlesham Forest Incident particularly frustrating for researchers is not what happened in the woods, but what happened afterward. Or more accurately, what didn't happen. Despite multiple nights of unexplained activity, physical trace evidence, elevated radiation readings, and testimony from trained military observers, including a deputy base commander, there was no visible follow-up investigation. No forensic recovery team arrived from higher command. No general took charge of a comprehensive inquiry. No cross-border alert between UK and US forces was logged. Personnel who witnessed parts of the events were spoken to in private. Some were debriefed formally, others informally. Several witnesses later described being told not to speak about the incident, not as a direct threat, but as an understanding that public discussion wouldn't be appropriate. Whether this pressure came from superiors or from fear of ridicule, the result was the same: silence. Word eventually reached London. The Ministry of Defense received the Halt memo, reviewed it, and filed it away. Their official position, later repeated to journalists and researchers, became infamous. The incident was of no defense significance. That phrase would haunt the case for decades. To many, it felt like a bureaucratic dismissal, a way of saying, "We don't want to deal with this." But within the military community, that silence didn't mean forgetfulness. Among the men who were there, the memory remained sharp. Some spoke of it only after retirement. Others stayed quiet for decades. But nearly all agreed on one fundamental point: the incident was real, and no official explanation ever came. It's worth considering what didn't happen. For a Cold War base housing sensitive equipment and potentially nuclear weapons, the idea that command showed no curiosity about a low-altitude light-emitting object inside their fence line seems implausible. These installations were designed to respond to even the faintest intrusion, and yet, when something genuinely unexplained occurred, the response was to look away.
No examination of the Rendlesham case would be complete without addressing the skeptical explanations that have been proposed over the years. The most persistent theory centers on the Orfordness Lighthouse, which stands on the Suffolk coast several miles to the east. The lighthouse beam rotates regularly, sweeping across the horizon every 5 seconds. Skeptics argue that under the right conditions, fog, darkness, heightened stress, the beam could appear as a pulsing light in the forest, seeming to hover when viewed through trees. Another explanation focuses on bright celestial objects, particularly the star Sirius, which was unusually luminous in the December sky that year. The argument suggests that under stress and in unfamiliar terrain, an unusually bright star could appear to move, especially when viewed through branches that create visual distortion. There have also been suggestions of hoaxes. One theory proposes that base personnel orchestrated the lights as a prank, using flashlights, flares, or even painted balloons to fool the security detail. The implication being that trained military personnel were deceived by a practical joke. These explanations have gained traction in some circles, appearing in television documentaries and books by skeptical researchers, but they face significant challenges when examined against the full body of evidence. First, the lighthouse theory doesn't account for the movement patterns described by multiple witnesses across multiple nights. These weren't static or predictable lights. Witnesses described objects that changed position, divided into multiple points, and appeared to react to the observer's presence. Second, Peniston's testimony included close-range contact with a structured object. Whether or not his later claims about binary code are accepted, his original account described a craft with specific dimensions, texture, and symbols, details that can't be explained by a distant lighthouse or star. Third, the physical evidence presents problems for conventional explanations. The ground indentations, broken branches, scorched trees, and elevated radiation readings require something with mass and energy to have been present at the site. Finally, the Halt Tape itself captures multiple observers reacting to lights moving through the trees, not across the distant sky. The audio includes directional changes, descriptions of metallic sounds, and references to compass interference, none of which align with a lighthouse beam or celestial object.
Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the Rendlesham case isn't the evidence collected in 1980, but how the witnesses have carried the experience through the decades that followed. John Burroughs, one of the first responders who entered the forest on that initial night, eventually developed serious health problems. He underwent heart surgeries and faced unexplained medical issues. When he sought his complete military medical records, he discovered they had been classified. After pressure from media and legal advocates, the Department of Veterans Affairs eventually acknowledged that his health issues were connected to service-related exposure to an unidentified phenomenon during his military service. This was the first and remains the only official government recognition connecting a Rendlesham witness to a physical injury sustained during the event. It wasn't front-page news in every newspaper, but for those following the case closely, it represented a crack in the wall of official denial. Jim Peniston took a different path. Beyond the binary code revelation, he continued sharing detailed memories of that first night, maintaining that he touched the craft, examined its surface, and observed symbols that didn't match any known language or military marking system. His testimony has remained remarkably consistent over 4 decades, even as other details from different witnesses have varied or evolved. Charles Halt, who initially tried to remain neutral and professional about the incident, eventually grew more outspoken. In later interviews, he stated bluntly that what they encountered was not a lighthouse, not a misidentification, but something real and unexplained. For him, the continued denial of official interest became its own mystery. If nothing significant happened, why were files still sealed? Why did it take so long to acknowledge even basic medical claims from witnesses? The psychological toll on these men shouldn't be underestimated. They were trained military personnel who served their country with distinction. They followed protocol, documented what they saw, and reported through proper channels. And yet, for decades, their testimony was either ignored, dismissed, or used as fodder for entertainment rather than serious investigation.
One theory that has gained traction over the years is that disinformation may have played a role in how the Rendlesham case unfolded after the fact. The concept is straightforward. If something genuinely significant occurred at Rendlesham Forest, something that military intelligence didn't understand or couldn't control, the best strategy might not be outright denial. Instead, allow the story to spiral into competing claims, contradictory statements, and confusion. By letting multiple versions circulate, each with slightly different details, the original truth becomes impossible to verify. The case transforms from a clear incident into an unsolvable puzzle. This wouldn't be unprecedented. During the Cold War era, intelligence agencies on both sides employed sophisticated disinformation campaigns.
Project Blue Book in the United States, ostensibly designed to investigate UFO reports, often served to contain and dismiss cases rather than genuinely investigate them. By providing conventional explanations, weather balloons, swamp gas, misidentified aircraft, authorities could acknowledge public concerns while steering attention away from anything genuinely anomalous. In Rendlesham's case, several elements support this theory. The lack of follow-up investigation, despite compelling evidence, suggests containment rather than curiosity. The delayed public release of the Halt memo, years after the event, ensured the story entered public consciousness only after memories had faded and details had become harder to verify. The conflicting testimonies from various witnesses, whether genuine differences in perception or encouraged inconsistencies, created enough ambiguity that no single narrative could dominate. Some researchers point to the fact that witnesses were debriefed separately and told different things about what they should or shouldn't discuss. Others note that key documents, including radar logs that would definitively show whether objects were tracked in the airspace that night, have never been released or are claimed not to exist. The most disturbing possibility is that the confusion isn't accidental, but intentional. By keeping the case in perpetual debate, authorities ensure it never becomes actionable. It remains a curiosity, endlessly discussed, but never resolved. More than 40 years after the events in Rendlesham Forest, the case continues to matter, and not just to UFO enthusiasts or conspiracy theorists. It matters because of what it represents about evidence, credibility, and institutional response to the unknown. Unlike many UFO cases that rely on civilian witnesses or amateur footage, Rendlesham involved trained military observers operating under chain of command at a sensitive installation during the Cold War. These weren't people predisposed to believing in flying saucers. They were security personnel doing their jobs when something unexplained entered their operational space. The case also has an unusual amount of documentation for an event of this nature. There's the Halt Tape, recorded in real time with no opportunity for later embellishment. There's the official memo submitted to the Ministry of Defense through proper channels. There are ground photographs, radiation measurements, and multiple witnesses who corroborate core aspects of the events, even if they disagree on specific details. What makes Rendlesham particularly significant in the broader context of UFO research is that it doesn't require belief in extraordinary claims to acknowledge something strange occurred. Even the most conservative interpretation of the evidence acknowledges that multiple trained observers encountered something they couldn't identify, that physical traces were left behind, and that official channels showed unusual reluctance to investigate further. In recent years, the conversation around unidentified aerial phenomena has shifted dramatically. The United States government has acknowledged the reality of encounters between military personnel and objects displaying flight characteristics that can't be explained by known technology. Congressional hearings have featured testimony from credible witnesses. Task forces have been established to study these incidents. Within this new framework of transparency, cases like Rendlesham deserve re-examination. If we accept that unexplained aerial phenomena are real, and the government now officially does, then Rendlesham isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a well-documented military encounter that was never properly investigated, despite meeting every criterion for serious attention.
The Rendlesham Forest today is quiet. Walking those paths now, you'd find information boards marking the UFO trail, memorial signs, and replicas of the object reportedly seen that December night. It's peaceful, almost quaint. Tourists visit, school groups learn about the incident. The forest has been transformed into a destination for the curious. But for those who were there in 1980, the trees still carry weight. Memory clings to the bark. For Jim Peniston, John Burroughs, Charles Halt, and the others who entered those woods expecting routine patrol duties, the experience split time into before and after. Will we ever know exactly what happened? Perhaps not in the way we'd like. The complete truth may remain locked in classified files that will never see public release. Witnesses' memories, however consistent,
will always be subject to the inevitable distortions of time and trauma. The physical evidence, compelling as it is, doesn't provide definitive answers about origin or intent. But maybe that's not the point. Maybe the value of the Rendlesham Forest Incident lies not in solving it completely, but in what it teaches us about how we respond to the unknown. The case demonstrates that even when trained observers report something extraordinary, even when physical evidence supports their claims, even when proper channels are followed and documentation is thorough, institutional silence is often silence. That silence speaks volumes. It suggests that some questions make us more uncomfortable than any answer ever could. It reveals that our systems of knowledge and control don't have room for phenomena that don't fit established categories. And it shows that truth, when inconvenient, can be buried not through active denial, but through passive neglect. The men who stood in Rendlesham Forest that December didn't ask to become part of history. They were doing their jobs, following orders, serving their country. What they encountered challenged everything they'd been trained to understand about reality. And rather than receiving answers or support, they received decades of silence, skepticism, and dismissal. Their story endures because it represents something larger than strange lights in the woods. It represents the gap between what we're willing to acknowledge and what we're actually encountering. It stands as evidence that trained observers can report something extraordinary, document it properly, follow every protocol, and still be met with institutional silence. As we move forward into an era of greater transparency around unidentified aerial phenomena, the Rendlesham Forest Incident serves as both warning and opportunity. A warning about how easily uncomfortable truths can be buried, and an opportunity to finally examine with open minds what really happened when those lights descended into the Suffolk woods. The forest is still there, waiting beneath the same sky, holding the same silence. And the question remains, not just about what appeared among those trees, but about why, after all these years, we still don't have answers. Perhaps someday we will. Until then, Rendlesham stands as a testament to the unknown, a reminder that beneath our certainty, beneath our systems and explanations, there are still moments when something breaks through, quietly, without warning, and changes everything. Thank you for listening. If you found this examination of the Rendlesham Forest Incident compelling, please share it with others who might appreciate a thoughtful look at one of the most credible UFO cases in military history. And if you have thoughts about what really happened in those woods, we'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below.